This time, we don't see Dredd's face. There's very little comedy, and a Lannister pays a debt to society. It's the 2012 version of Dredd.
800 million people living in the ruin of the old world. Only one thing fighting for order in the chaos. The men and women of the Hall of Justice.
Madeline Madrigal. She had control of everything. Levels 1 to 200.
How'd she get away with it?
You know how often we get a judge up in peace trees?
Well, you got one now.
This is the Superhero Pantheon. On this podcast, we take one superhero film a week and decide whether it should be in the Pantheon, the pile of shame, or somewhere in between. My name is Jerome Cuson. You can find me on Twitter at JeromeC1985. You can find additional episodes of this podcast through Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and all of your favorite podcast apps through the real world. We strongly encourage you to leave a 4 or 5 star review so as to help people discover this show and the great work that the folks at the real world are doing. If you would like to interact with us or send feedback, you can do so in 2 ways. First, send an email to superheropantheon@gmail.com. Second, find us on Twitter at HeroPantheon. My co-host for this week and every week will be Brian DeBrain. He can be found on Twitter at Brian DeBrain. Brian, I just have one simple question for you. Have you been dreading watching this movie again?
Here's the deal. I had never seen this before until this podcast. So this is the first time, my first viewing of it. And I know that sounds like a shock. And I know to a lot of my friends it's still a shock because they've been telling me for 6 years to watch this movie now. And I finally watched it. And then I finally did it, and it's pretty good. I mean, it has some flaws, but we'll get into that in a second. But I think Karl Urban gets the idea of the character so well, and the director really gets the idea of what Dredd should be, and they nailed it.
All right, so in considering what you mentioned first about Karl Urban, unlike the previous Judge Dredd movie, Karl Urban does not take the helmet off, and this is a really huge deal. I think it speaks a lot to Karl Urban and the commitment that he has to this character, that he did not take the helmet off. And I completely understand that he is not a huge star, but he is somebody who I think still has enough pull to where if he wanted to take the damn helmet off, that is absolutely what he would have done. In addition, Karl Urban also rode the Lawmaster motorcycle himself, and I also think that's really cool, just doing his own stunts. Now, you mentioned the director of this movie. The director of this movie is officially listed as Pete Travis, but just like some of the issues that existed with the first Judge Dredd, there is a discussion about who actually directed this movie. In 2018, Karl Urban said that Alex Garland, who has directed such films as Ex Machina as well as Annihilation, that it is in fact Alex Garland who actually ended up directing most of this movie. We've kind of talked about the issues in the past with changing directors, and this appears to be another example of that. So I just wanted to talk about that off the top, that when we talk about the director, we should probably be talking about it in terms of Alex Garland.
Right, and if you look at the IMDb credits, the credited director doesn't really have a career after this and really had like a kind of a straight-to-DVD type career up until Dredd. But then Alex Garland went on to do Annihilation. I know I haven't seen Annihilation, but I know you love that movie a lot. And I think that's your movie of the decade almost. So I think that goes to show you why this movie gets the credit it deserves, even though it's attached to a director who doesn't deserve the credit.
I think Annihilation is pretty phenomenal. I also think Ex Machina is pretty great. I'm really excited to see his show on FX, and I think you can see a lot of Alex Garland in this movie for better and for worse sometimes. And when thinking about one of the other important characters, we have to talk about Mama, who is played by Lena Hedley. Some of Mama's tattoos are Lena Hedley's actual tattoos, most notably the flower on her upper right arm, and the makeup artist took the design and it expanded to her neck and face. That's a really nice character detail. If you look in her penthouse, you will see a judge's helmet hanging on her wall with a length of gold chain attached to it, a nod to the comic design of Judge Dredd, where the gold chain would link the badge to the uniform collar, and I think we got a little bit of that in the 1995 version, but definitely not so much in this one.
Yeah, that's kind of the thing I wanted from the suits, but that's kind of the other thing too. Is like because the idea of this movie takes place in this high rise covered in concrete, you kind of limit yourself of the natural lighting by the 2/3 of the movie into, or actually it's a third into the movie when they kind of close the high rise, but it kind of affects the lighting a lot. And I thought that maybe they kind of figured out a way out of it, but I don't know. But it just kind of made the suit kind of darker than usual, and then you kind of lose some of the detail. But I did like that little touch because that's what I loved about the Dredd in '95. It's just the suits look bright and great, and that gold kind of popped. So a nice little shout out to that.
I think the biggest thing that I can say about this movie is it is a lot smaller in a lot of ways. There is not this grandiose plot. It's actually relatively simple and straightforward to keep track. What I think this movie does so much better is handling a lot of the details of the world so much better. There are a lot of really subtle elements. For example, in the classroom in Peachtrees as well as in the mall, you can see the new American flag. It only has 6 stars. Those represent these mega states that we talked a little bit about last week, and that has continued. And in addition, the character of Mama was originally written as an elderly woman, but Lena Hedley convinced Alex Garland to make her a middle-aged person with a male-hater personality. And we will get into this later, but I think that's a really good choice because I think Lena Hedley is really awesome in this role.
Yeah, I like that choice as well. If they would have done the old lady makeup, that would have been kind of weird. But I guess the idea is maybe because she's pretty much the star of this, despite Karl Urban being Dredd. Like she is like the starring role. Like she's the most known. This was like Game of Thrones season 3 at this point, so she was definitely well known. Um, and I think that it would have taken away from the performance if she was like an older lady. So I'm glad they changed that. And the whole man hating thing, yeah, I get that. And she's a former prostitute, and it's a lot of fucked up shit in their background. We'll talk about the performance when we get to the villain score, but I just thought maybe she was just playing a little too stoned. Because I think that's the idea is that everyone's pretty, oh, at least all the bad guys in this movie have like the slow mo in their veins kind of thing going on. So we'll get to that in a second.
There are 3 different treatments that Alex Garland wrote before settling for the story that exists in this movie. And if you look at some of those, it would have been a little bit too much, especially given the budget that they had, some of the budget limitations. What you ended up with is you got something similar in a way to Training Day, where you have this experienced police officer in Dredd training a rookie, in this case Cassandra Anderson. And of course, you get Karl Urban doing a really good impression of young Clint Eastwood, in a way, and some of some of Keith Carradine's work as well, and David Carradine. You get some of that in his performance. But a significant difference between this movie and the previous movie is we actually get introduced to mutants, which is inexplicable to me because they actually use the word mutant, and I didn't even know that was legal to do. But in this case, rookie Cassandra Anderson is a telepath, and it's made clear right from the start. They don't do a lot of explaining, and in a way, I think that's a good thing, because I think it would almost take away from the movie if they try to explain her powers. It's kind of done in such a matter-of-fact way that I think it comes off really well. It comes off really natural. It gives them a pretext for her to not have the helmet on, too. So you have Dredd, who can just keep his helmet on the whole time. You also have Cassandra Anderson, who isn't wearing the helmet, but we can be more sympathetic towards her. A lot of it is because she is a young woman, but we also get to see her use her powers. And there is a specific scene where she let a character use her sidearm against her in an imagined fight, which planted the idea of using the weapon against her in his mind. And then later, when Kay goes to use the gun for real, it turns out very badly for him as he shoots his own arm off, as the lawgiver explosively self-destructs if anyone but the judge uses it. So I thought that was one of the more subtler character moments in the movie that I did not even notice the first 2 times, and it was only in reading this that I realized that. But that was a brilliant piece of screenwriting.
Yeah, this is kind of living in that post-Inception kind of world, so that's not surprising. This is what 3 years after Inception, but maybe it was just a coincidence. But it was very smart because when I read the notes, I was like, "Oh yeah, that does make sense. That's why he did go for the gun." Because I think knowing ahead, like you should know that, or everyone should know that grabbing a judge's gun, like it's not going to work. I feel like that's something that is known in this universe, but I think it just she got into his head and he kind of slipped his mind and he grabbed the gun anyway. So I thought that was a nice little touch from Avon Barksdale.
We are only allowed to call him Avon Barksdale at this point. Let's talk about the heroes. I love Karl Urban's performance in this movie. I think he plays it very serious, totally deadpan. We never see his face one time. And I think in many ways, Anderson, played by Olivia Thirlby, is the lead and kind of the audience surrogate. This movie is heavily focused on them. We really don't see a lot of other heroic characters. They're really the only heroes in this movie. I think they have a really good chemistry. It's not a romantic chemistry. That's the other thing that I really appreciated about this movie. That you had a male character and a female character together, and we don't get a tease of romance. I really think that's something that doesn't happen enough, because this is an action movie. We don't have to throw in the romantic angle, and we don't just have to shoehorn it in, because that's exactly what happened in Judge Dredd, and it did not come off very well. I like the telekinesis. I think it was I think it was good from a plot mechanic standpoint, and I really like the way that she used her powers. She did not have to be a damsel in distress. She could take care of herself. I like some of the shortcuts that it was also able to do, because it helped this movie be a very lean 95 minutes.
Yeah, it's weird because the whole time I thought it was a red herring or something and like she was going to turn on him. And I guess I'm just so used to that kind of thing where like, oh, she's going to turn on him or he's going to turn on her. Or you know what I mean? Like the big turn at the end. And I guess we didn't really get that. It was just her being a mutant and using her powers for the first time. And you're right, it turns into this training day type situation. And maybe that just goes to, I don't know, maybe it's the wrestling inside of us that I was expecting like a heel turn from her because it was just so weird throwing her in there. But then I felt like she almost had no payoff at the end, but I guess there was no point. It's just like her on her first day, and Dredd happens to be your teacher. So there's not really necessarily like what's the big payoff to her powers? Is she gonna like try to fight Dredd or blah blah blah? That's kind of what I was thinking, but it never went to that level. So, um, and Karl Urban, man, like I mentioned last week about how maybe Clint Eastwood in the '60s without taking the helmet off. That's kind of what I get from Karl Urban here. Like it's very much Dirty Harry. It's very much that Charles Bronson kind of thing. And at points, like it feels like he's trying to do Rambo because like um, that one there's a one scene where he's on the microphone and on the monitor and he's like I'm coming for you mama or whatever and that's like almost right out of Rambo 2 when he does the thing to the general who turned on him. So I thought that was a nice little nod. And then there was at some points where you see the facial expressions at the bottom of his mask and it just almost looks like mirrored like Stallone like on the poster of the original Dredd. So I thought that was kind of like a cool nod as well. He really gets the performance down in this movie. The dry deadpan humor, you're right, that was great. And I thought like, man, this movie's not that funny, but then kind of like looking back and then looking at some of the clips on YouTube after the movie and looking at what Karl Urban was saying, it's like, yeah, it is kind of funny because he's not saying it straight, he's saying it straight, all these lines, and then even when he's like, it's a death sentence I'm giving you, and it's just like you can't help but laugh at the end when he's like throwing Lena Hedley out the window, but man, he's just so serious. And they try to do very some comedy, but there's very little comedy in this movie compared to the '95 version, which is a good thing I think. Different tone. At least they got the tone down. You know what I mean? So and they got the tone down for the character. Yeah, I'm going with a 7. I almost went with an 8, but I just felt like if it was lacking something, and I think I just wanted more Dread in the daylight. You know what I mean? Because once like I said, once you're in this concrete building that's blocked off by sunlight, no sunlight, the lighting is not going to be great. So, I just wanted to see more of him in the daytime like it was in the beginning of the movie.
Right, I think there was just a little bit missing between this relationship to really hammer home the point and give it an 8. I'm also giving this a 7. I did not necessarily want a romantic story. I almost wish that we could have got more character development for Cassandra Anderson, not necessarily explaining how she got her powers. That does not interest me in the least, but at least giving her more development and talking more about her character. I would have appreciated that. So the villains. Lena Hedley is probably one of my favorite villain-esque performances as far as female characters go. I love the look of her character. I love her tone. She is so vicious. It is easy to see why you would cast her as Cersei Lannister. It's an absolute layup, and this did come between the first couple seasons of Game of Thrones, back when that show was not a global phenomenon. So I would argue that this is just before she really took off. And I know that you are going to disagree with me, so the floor will be yours in just a second, but just know that I think the way that she carries herself in this movie, she comes off like such a threat. I love her facial expressions. I think they've been the highlight of Game of Thrones as well. And even though she does not physically do a lot, she comes across like a menace and a threat, and that is really hard to do. And she also comes off like a full-fledged character, something that is extremely difficult because, I mean, the aspect of her being a former prostitute is kind of a trope that I don't think we needed, but I think Lena Hedley makes it work. I think she's awesome in this movie.
I don't know. For me, something's missing. Like, I don't know if it's because, like I said, like because of the slow mo drug that they're on, and she takes the drug at the beginning of the movie, and you see her like slow motion in the bathtub. She just like seems so emotionless. But I don't know if that's just the way I'm reading it. But I noticed the facial expressions of those little things, and then the speech she gives to Dredd on the PA system, and then. But then when it's like when she gets behind the machine guns, she's like showing no aggression as much. I don't know if she was just kind of lacking something, or the director told her like, "Hey, you're firing this machine gun, but don't get too into it. Just kind of be like smooth and cool about it." But maybe it was just too smooth and cool. Because like even by the end when she gets killed, like it feels like there's no conflict. It just feels like she's just standing there, and she takes a bullet, and she's like, "If you kill me, I'm gonna the whole thing is gonna blow up," and then she just gets thrown to the bottom. But I don't know, just something was just missing for me, and I get that you like the subtleties of her performance and that she's this seemingly like this like evil menace, but I don't know, just I felt like the way that they portrayed Dredd, and especially with the psychic powers of Cassandra, like it just felt like these bad guys had no shot at taking down the good guys. And I know that scene with the machine gun was supposed to be like, okay, this is kind of this big threat moment, but just the way that I know the character Dredd and just the idea behind the character, um, and the way that it's supposed to be, like there's no way that they're gonna, it's not gonna be a threat to him, and it really wasn't, And at no point in the film did I feel like the villains were a true threat, even when they caught the drug dealer, and for all intents and purposes, we'll call him Avon Barksdale. Even when they catch him, I just felt like, why are you catching him? Just kill him. He just killed these guys. Just kill him. And then they ended up killing him anyway. But I guess they needed to like probe his mind or something to figure out all the details of the drug deal and stuff. But um, I don't know. I just felt like there were just no threats of the good guys, because the good guys were just so awesome and powerful that by the end of the movie, it just felt like, okay, there's got to be a twist, right? That's maybe why I thought that Cassandra was going to turn on him, because that would be the big fight at the end, but there really wasn't that.
I'm glad there wasn't a twist. I think that's something that would have been almost too predictable, and I think would have kind of violated the spirit of this movie. I think this movie is kind of designed to be a little bit on the straightforward side, and they're kind of playing with some of the tropes and playing with these things, and they're basically kind of doing an action movie version of The Raid. That's what this movie is. You see this kind of movie done very frequently. It's been done a number of times this decade, a movie that takes place in a giant 200-story tower, and this is what happens when you have a limited budget. You kind of do something like this, and it's kind of done in this dystopian way, and I think the problem is that the villains are not as strong from a threat perspective. I really like Wood Harris as a performer. I think he's a tremendous character actor. I think he is also really good in Creed, a movie that we talked a lot about last week. I think he does a good job playing the MacGuffin of this movie, and the reason that they have to keep him alive, or the reason they want to keep him alive, is because they want to arrest him, and they want to expose Mama and her entire gang and bring them into jail the legal way. They don't want to murder all of these people, which is what they end up doing, but that's kind of what they have to do. Domhnall Gleeson nails his role of playing a person subservient to Mama. I really love Gleeson in these roles. I think he's really good in both of the Star Wars movies, kind of playing the same role, except this time he's really, really stoned, and in Star Wars he's just kind of a goofball. The side characters, there are a group of judges that turn on Dredd and Cassandra Anderson, and because we really don't know who these judges are, and part of this, it is kind of a flaw that we don't see their faces and their facial expressions, so we don't really get a lot of character development because they're literally on the screen for a minute before they take Mama's money and decide to go after our two heroes. But I think they're pretty useless and don't come off as nearly as much of a threat. So I'm a bit conflicted with how to approach this score, but because I really like Lena Hedley, Wood Harris, and Donald Gleason, I'm giving this an 8, and this is my highest score for this movie.
I'll go with a 6, and I just felt like Domhnall Gleeson was, I don't know, he's more of a hero. Well, because he was being forced in that role of being the bad guy, but by the end he kind of was more of the hero because he kind of sets her up at the end. But um, I just want to shout out, like, I think his performance in Force Awakens is really underrated, especially the scene where he blows up those planets and he does it with that straight babyface, kind of look. I thought that was really underrated. So that's just me going on a little sidetrack because I thought this might be the only chance I can talk about his performance in Force Awakens. So there you go.
Which is funny because I much preferred his performance in The Last Jedi, especially the opening scene, which I know you don't like.
Yeah, well, whatever. But I'll go with a 6. I know you go with the 8, but I wasn't connecting with Lena Headley as much in this performance. But I don't know. Maybe it's just because, like I said, the drug slows you down, and I don't know if they were supposed to be drugged out and stoned. But I mean, Domhnall Gleeson was definitely stoned in this one.
I think that one of the issues with the story is that it is very simplistic, and this is kind of a story that has been done to death in a lot of these movies, where you essentially have a new drug on the market, and the cops are trying to expose that drug and shut it down. This is a plot that we've seen in a number of buddy cop movies, so you're not getting something that's necessarily original. I think what separates this movie in a lot of ways is the execution of the set design and the costumes and the ultra violence. That's what makes this movie. I think the performances by Karl Urban, Olivia Thirlby, Lena Headley, that to me is what makes this movie great. The actual story itself is something that we've seen. The premise is very similar to Judge Dredd, as the judges have the combined powers of judge, jury, and instant executioner. Anderson is a rookie cop trying to earn the respect and trying to pass. So you get her taking these little mini tests throughout the movie from Judge Dredd. And ultimately, she does pass because she survives this day from hell in this giant 200-story vertical slum that is controlled by Mama and her ruthless clan. And what you get is you get a lot of scenes where they're trying to make their way up, and where Mama is trying to kill. We get a pretty vicious machine gun sequence. We do get some humans being killed on the sidelines. There's no way out for Dredd and Anderson, so they have to kind of fight for their survival, and they are treated as the underdogs. I'm not sure if the execution of that is the best. So my story score is pretty on the low side. I'm giving this a 6.
Yeah, so it's weird. Like, I like the idea of them being in this this one area. I like it when they can take a plot like that and make it simple, and then make it simple on the budget. But then the execution is where it's at, right? So it felt like the Bruce Lee movie Game of Death, where it's like in Game of Death he's in this tower and he's got to work his way up to the tower to fight Kareem Abdul-Jabbar as the main boss, right? And it felt like the same idea because they're trying to get to the top and try to get to Mama. So I like that concept. The only thing is just, they just didn't feel like a threat. Like every bad guy that got in their way, they just took out easily, and it felt like they took him out really easily. Even I know the judges shot Karl Urban in the stomach, and then he kind of fixes his own wound, which I think is also another Rambo reference, because in Rambo 3, he fixes his own wound in a badass way like that in the same area in the stomach. So I guess that's another Sylvester Stallone shout out. But just some of the stuff, I don't know, I just feel like the weaknesses fall in the villains, because Karl Urban as this Dredd is so badass, and the fact that you got a psychic there that can get into people's heads, they're almost unstoppable by the end. And by the end of the movie, the last sequence where they're going up into the tower and finally into Mama's room, it's like they almost had no trouble doing it at all, So that's kind of where my complaints are, because I felt like they should have did something. I think they should have caught Dredd and torched him a little bit, and then right before they take his helmet off, that's when he gets out and freed. I think that would have added some tension and some vulnerability because like we don't get any vulnerability with Dredd, so I think that might be the problem because he's like this ultimate badass, and by the end of the movie, you just feel like it's almost like John Wick. In John Wick, you feel like oh he's just gonna win at the end, and that's kind of my issues with the John Wick movies as well. It's just like he's so badass that by the end of the movie, you don't buy into the villain. So that's kind of where I'm at with this one. So I'll give it a six as well. But I just like that idea of the whole game of death concept, working your way up to 200 floors, and then working around the simplistic concept, and then well, outside of the technical score as well, but the idea of doing that kind of high rise, doing the camera angles of shooting directly across the high rise on the same level, and you get kind of cool camera shots like that. So
All right, let's get to the technical aspects. I like the set design and the costumes of this movie. I do appreciate the way the violence is shot. It feels so visceral, and I think that's the whole idea. I think the saturated colors, it kind of feels cliche, and I'm wondering if this is more of a 2019 problem than a 2012 one. I also think that the slow mo effect is used a little bit too much, and for those reasons, I have a hard time giving this any higher than a seven. But I also do like the score as well for this movie, which is pretty minimal compared to what we saw last week, but I think it serves its purpose.
yeah, it's got a very techno score, and it very much fits that sci-fi kind of feel this movie has. So that I liked a lot. But the problem is this budget is $50 million, and by the end of the movie, you start seeing through it because I feel like some of the CGI doesn't quite, render well. And then you just mentioned the colors and the fact that because there's no natural light, 2/3 of the movie that you can't really see a lot of the suits, and you really see the suit at the beginning of the movie in the daylight when he's on the motorcycle, and you see kind of where all the details are. But then once he goes inside, like all the details kind of get dark and in the shadows. So that you can kind of see through the budget is what I'm kind of saying. It's like yeah, it's $50 million budget and they're doing the best they can, but you can kind of tell that like they're relying a lot on like practical sets, which I like, but it's not. It just seems like a straight to DVD kind of movie at times when you look at the sets. So that's kind of where it's at. It's like they're trying so hard to have this dystopian future, but everything just feels like a dirty version of what everything is now. So it wasn't as like futuristic as the Judge Dredd in '95. I felt the '95 version was more futuristic and got really into that creativity. But because of the limited budget, they couldn't really do as much, and they kind of had to focus on, okay, we need to get these performers, and then we need to get a lot of guns in here. So that's kind of where it is for me. I'm giving it a six, and I know it's gonna be kind of shocking because I usually give good technical scores, but I just kind of saw through the budget on this one.
All right, let's get to the legacy of this movie. This bombed at the box office pretty badly, but I would say it's become a cult classic and has become one of the more underrated action movies of the decade. And I think Alex Garland himself has become one of the more interesting directors with his two most recent and official movies, even though he technically did not direct this. We're going to give him credit for it. I had a hard time with this one because, yes, it did bomb, but I feel like it's become a cult classic. So I'm giving this a 6.
I'm going with a seven just because I went back and kind of went through some YouTube clips and kind of rewatched some scenes before we recorded. And just looking at all the comments, there seems to be a really high, like, following or like a really big following for this movie in the same way that you're describing. And there's a lot of comments about Lena Hedley in this movie and about being an awesome villain. So maybe it's just me, but maybe it's just that, her performance kind of gravitated towards a lot of people like yourself. And I think that's part of that cult status that it's getting because of her performance. And then Karl Urban not taking off the mask, I think adds a lot to this idea of this movie. It adds to like if you're trying to describe this movie to a person or a friend of yours, and you just tell like the guy never takes off his mask and he's the good guy, and be like, oh, okay, that's interesting. I've never seen that before. So I think that adds something to it. So yeah, I'll go with a seven just because like it's a lot of word of mouth, and it's not just like a few people. Like it's a lot of word of mouth from like people from past coworkers, from my friends over the years, and I just didn't watch it until now because I just didn't have the time to sit down and watch it. But I didn't even realize it was 90 minutes. I thought it was a lot longer, but it being 90 minutes does help a lot too.
I love that loved running time. I love the 90-minute running time. I think it makes a huge difference. And my total score is very positive. It's 33, which is the highest score I've given in weeks, given all the Turtles movies that we've been watching lately.
Right. Yeah, mine's at 32, and I know I was very critical about the villains and the story, but Just high praises for Karl Urban. You know what I mean? Like he really brings Dredd to life in this. And then this cult following that's built over the years. And if you look at the numbers, um, if these people that watched it on DVD actually went and watched it in theaters originally, it probably would have made 70 to 80 million dollars in my value, in my estimation. So I think there is value to this franchise. Um, I don't know. Maybe it's just best suited for Netflix at this point because if you're going to do it on a limited budget anyway. But then again, you look at like the MCU and they're spending like $100 million on an episode, or $50 million to $100 million per episode on those MCU things. So it's very interesting because I feel like if they give them more, a little more than they were given originally, they can kind of fix those CGI problems and do stuff during the daylight and make it brighter and do things a little better. Keep the same elements that made it great, just kind of brighten it up a little bit.
I think that what makes this movie so special is Lena Hedley, and I know that you are not a fan of her performance, but for me, I think that she is the person that makes this movie go round, and I think so much of that has to do with the fact that villains in these movies generally don't work. For whatever reason, it's hard to give them background, it's hard to give them a story, and in this case, you get so much of that, and I think she is such a dynamic and charismatic performer that I think she brings all of that to light, even though her character still isn't as well developed as it could be. I think that she is the difference between this being just another run of the mill, like straight to DVD movie versus something that I think has legitimately become a cult classic. All right, Brian. I don't know how you're going to feel about this first one. How badly did you want to see Lena Headley as a villain in the MCU after watching this movie?
See, here's the thing. Like, I've had this idea about her since like maybe season two of Game of Thrones, man. Like, um, a little after season two or three of Game of Thrones, when I stopped watching, I did read the Marvel Infinity War or Infinity Gauntlet and Lady Death. I know a lot of people picture Angelina Jolie as Lady Death, but I think she's just too tied to Malfition or whatever, and that's kind of her thing now. So I picture her as Lady Death, and I don't know if they're going to bring it or bring her in now because that's kind of past the whole Infinity saga. That's kind of done with, but I know she was a big player in the Infinity Saga, in being the love interest of Thanos. But I totally picture her as that because that's kind of what she is in pretty much in this movie. She's like Lady Death in this movie.
Make Doctor Doom female and make Lena Headley Doctor Doom. Boom!
I'm cool with that too because I mean, if they turn Doc Ock into a woman and into the Spider Verse, why not? And don't just do it for the sake of, but just do it because it fits what the character wants to be represented as in this current time.
Absolutely. I think that she could absolutely kill it, and I think she would be just as much of a threat. I think it would be really original to do something like that, and I just want to see her have a substantive role in the MCU at this point because she's no longer on Game of Thrones, so you can bring her into this universe. And I think if you're going to do it, don't do it as a one off, but do it like Thanos, where she is being built up and she ultimately becomes a threat that is something that takes like two or three movies to ultimately fix. All right, Brian, is Carl Urban actually good in this movie? Because I think he's really good in this movie.
I think he's great in general. Like he's great in this movie. Ever since Star Trek, 2009 Star Trek, I've been all in, and I know he was in Lord of the Rings as well. But what got me all in on Carl Urban was his performance as Bones. So that's it for me. And I thought he's probably, in my opinion, the best actor in the new Star Trek movies out of all of them, and that includes Cumberbatch playing Khan. I just feel like he gets Bones so well and the mannerisms of the original actor who played Bones. So for me, he's great, and that's what kind of sold me. And then when I found out he was in this, I mean, in 2012, I was like, I don't know if that works because he's just so funny as Bones. Like I always thought him as like a funny guy after Star Trek, but then he just brings back that deep voice, and now he's back in The Boys. So I think he's got this range between comedy and like even not necessarily drama, but like action and comedy. He does really well.
I think he's become a really good character actor. And how could you forget him playing the lead role in the titular film Doom?
Oh, I blocked that out of my head. I really blocked that out of my head. That's one of those movies.
that movie is really, really terrible and should never be spoken of again. But I'm glad to see that Karl Urban has recovered, and I think he's very good in supporting roles or roles where he is part of an ensemble, like The Boys, like this one, like Star Trek. I agree, he is pretty fantastic as Bones, and has really good comedic chemistry with Chris Pine. How much did you mark out for Wood Harris playing a drug dealer again? Because I sure did. Big time.
Yeah, I know that's kind of weird to say, but we're big Wire fans, man. And him in season one was great. Him being in jail in season two and all that drama, the Avon Barksdale drama and all that stuff. It just brought it back. And seeing him in the drug game again, and I was like, man, it feels like the Wire all over again. But but at the same time, like you mentioned Creed, and he was great in Creed, so I thought of him in that as well. So it's just like it's good to see him in these different roles. It sucks that he doesn't feel like a main player in any of the things I see him in now, but maybe he's just best suited to be like this great side role, and he's kind of cool with that.
Did the telekinesis aspect of the plot need more explanation? Because I don't think it did. I am just happy with the way that they treated it as if it is just very common. I have no problem with how they did this.
Yeah, I'm cool with it too because in this kind of like sci-fi post-apocalyptic world, things evolve, and this takes place, I think, in what 100 years after, like 100 years from now. So it makes sense that things can evolve, and especially with like the drugs that they're on. God knows what other drugs they've been doing in this world, but a psychic doesn't surprise me.
Should this version of Dredd be rebooted as a streaming procedural show?
I wouldn't necessarily reboot, just make a sequel series, like I mentioned Netflix, just go back to that, maybe 30-minute episodes, and then kind of limit your budget. Not too many explosive stuff. You don't have to fire a machine gun every episode, but just have Karl Urban do his thing as Dredd and never take off the helmet, and maybe tease it every now and then, but then you have these like stuff where he's in the shadows and he takes the helmet off, but you still don't see it, like at the beginning of the movie when he put the helmet on. So there's a lot to play with, and especially now with this cult following that it has. And I think a lot of people watched on Netflix too, because I know my buddy like mentioned to me like for the last couple of years one of his favorite movies to watch while he's at work, and he's that kind of person that gets the luxury of putting on Netflix while he works at work. But he says that it's one of those movies he puts on all the time, and it just leaves it in the background, and he loves it. So a Netflix show I think would do wonders and do big numbers actually.
I think putting this on either Netflix or Amazon Prime, I certainly think would work out really well. I'm hopeful that we can get some version of this at some point, even though this was not a box office success. But Alex Garland has a lot of power, so I will be very curious to see what happens there if anything ever comes up. Well, we have come to an end of our mini run talking about both of the Dredd movies. We are not going to talk about what we're doing next week, Brian. Next week is Thanksgiving week, and we are going to have a holiday treat for everyone, but I am not going to say here what we're talking about. You're just going to have to wait until next week to download the episode for goodies, possible special guests, and all that jazz.
Yeah, and my original idea was to do something related to birds being at Thanksgiving and maybe a Howard the Duck, but that's not going to happen. Or is it?
We are saving. We are saving. I'm calling it the Marvel Leftovers, which is funny because next week is Thanksgiving. We will be starting 2020 with the Marvel Leftovers because we have to review Howard the Duck, 3 Punisher movies, a Captain America movie. Yes, there is a Captain America movie, as well as 2 Ghost Riders and Daredevil.
God, I forgot we haven't watched Daredevil yet. Wow. Wow, I thought we'd have watched it by now. We watched a lecture before Daredevil. Who would have thunk it? But there's a lot to talk about when it comes to all those movies. So, but next week's the big mystery. Is it Mystery Vortex? I don't know. I've been to Mystery Vortex at PWG, so it might have that feel to it. You never know.
You never know. For Brian, my name is Jerome. Thank you so much for listening. We will talk to you next week.
I guess technically you can say Mama did kill a man.